health, wellness, and technology. In this special collaborative episode, we partner with our friends at Alchemic Sonic Environment. ASE is a global nomadic project exploring the nature of health through multisensory, deep listening experiences. Together, we continue to explore how music and sound can improve our lives. Immersed is brought to you by Studio Feed. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
Welcome, Dr. Jeff, Jill, to Project Immersed and Alchemic Sonic Environment's first dialogue collaboration. It's such an honor for us to have both of you pioneering beings in this space, working within the space of sound and health. And this platform is really bringing together sound, health, tech, music, intentions together. So it's more than an honor for us to have both of you sharing in space and dialogue with us today. I'd just like to start by asking both of you, how are you entering the session today?
Well, with optimism and cheeriness.
The world is in an interesting sort of phase right now. And something powerful that's positive is rising. And it's taking many forms. I mean, my world is filled with sound, and that's part of my thing. Anybody who's part of the process that's rising out of this continuum, that's involved in pushing the envelope of the positive in the world where it needs it dearly, and is aligning people together with sound or art or music or light or dance or anything that's pushing the envelope of it, I'm supportive of that. So here, when I find that there's a group of good people who are talented and have their heads screwed on correctly about what it's all about, then I'm involved. I'll say yes to that. So here I am. I'm not sure exactly where this is going to go or even what it's all about, but I have a dim idea, which sort of is kind of a metaphor for my whole life at this point. This is where I am. It's like, I don't know what the heck is going on, but I know it's good, so I'm involved.
I just like to qualify that because being in Europe, I'm perhaps a little more aware of not everything going well, and Ukraine. But actually, I did hear today that people are singing in Ukraine, and that singing is helping. You know, whether the children are having folk songs sung to them, or people are singing the national anthem to kind of boost their morale. But singing is helping, which so it's a
Beautiful.
it's good to hear that.
Beautiful. So I'm coming into this session extremely excited. I have Dr. Jeff, who I've known for a couple of years. In fact, I've been a patient of Dr. Jeff growing up to where I am today. And I have heard so much about you, Jill, through multiple people along the way of healing with sound. And today it's an honor to be in this company of both of you. So very excited, very honored, and very excited to begin. So just to start with, Jill Pearce is a British voice teacher. She is a family constellations therapist and an incredible voice, a pioneering voice that rediscovered ancient technologies of singing and vocal practices that she brought into the Western world already now many years ago, that has been shifting the sound healing movement for reminding us all the magic of the voice and its healing potential. So thank you, Jill. Dr. Jeff, for those of you that don't know him, is a pioneering doctor that's living within Carlsbad, San Diego, and he's the founder and the director of the Center for Neuroacoustic Research, where he's really working with the vision of bringing mind, body, heart, spirit into alignment through the scientific use of sound. And I will leave us at that point to just have this wisdom that we're going to be experiencing in the next hour to reveal itself as we deeply listen to this dialogue that's going to emerge on the topic of sound as freedom. So I just want to begin with a short introduction to the dialogue principles. Dialogue was built by Jiddu Krishnamurti and David Boehm, who I know, Jill, you have met in your lifetime. Very honored to have had that, have his presence here, and you've been part of that process in the beginning, where the intention of the dialogue is really focused on listening. It's letting go of all of our expert knowledge, our keynote presentation selves, our processes of what we think is right. Instead of that, we would like to focus on listening to each other. And so the intention is to be precise, to speak from your heart, and to listen like you'd like to be heard. And so as part of the dialogue and listening process, that's why the talking piece is important, to be able to create a ritualistic gesture of we're ready to begin speaking and sharing in the intention of the topic that we are going to be focusing on today. I think we can now begin the dialogue. So I'd like to pose this question to both of you, and let's kickstart this emergent conscious experience that we like to share. So the question that I have is, how can we utilize the transformative power of sound and music to build pathways of freedom in ourselves, in our world? I can repeat one more time. How can we utilize the transformative power of sound and music to build pathways of freedom in ourselves, in our world?
Wow. Well, for me, the most important sound is the sound of our own voice. It's the only living sound there is, and we are our own instrument. So that's my particular feeling, and also I'm very aware of the importance of community. So I think the combination of chanting in community, and chanting allows for community because sound both creates forms and boundaries, but also dissolves them. And so when you're chanting in a group, you become the group because the boundaries between you are dissolved. And this is, for me, a real path to liberation.
Is that a space? I mean, I can speak.
Yes, very much so.
It's interesting that we're, sound beings. We take a breath and we shoot shaped air packets of sound at each other, and somehow that has meaning. I love sitting around people who speak a different language than me. It's sort of what my pet might hear. These funny articulated packets of sound shooting out, and for me, it's I've always tread this funny path between scientist and artist, scientist and musician, composer. So I'm sitting in my recording studio, surrounded by keyboards and pianos and stuff. But I'm also a sound engineer, a scientist of sound, and a physician that's using sound. So I'm looking from a number of different angles. One is the science of sound, how sound waves can specifically affect your brain. brainwave states of consciousness, using EEG to monitor what's going on. Different types of sounds, different types of chord arrangements. How sound can precisely tune sound frequencies. We're not talking about music anymore. We're talking about raw sound vibrations at different frequencies can affect organ function or the autonomic nervous system and how it controls the system and how those might work together, and how all of it is arranged around the deep subconscious activation using certain types of sounds. For instance, I mean, all of us are born into sound. The first thing that any of us experience is sound in the womb. At 16 to 24 weeks, when the five senses first come online, you're in the dark, so your eyes aren't working, and your nose and mouth are filled with fluid, so those aren't working, but sound travels through water 5 times better than it does through air. So the only thing that any of us experience for the first 9 months in the womb is sound and vibration, amplified through the water and amniotic fluid. So we're all baptized in sound. We're sort of sonic water beings. When you're born, basically your body is filled with intracellular, extracellular fluid, and that saline solution is salty. We're sort of ocean beings. We're carrying the ocean in it like a spacesuit, so an ocean being can walk on the land. But all of us baptized in this kind of sound thing. So I think that's why sound has been the most primal tool to sort of get to the deepest part of your unconscious experience, because it's the first thing any of us ever experienced. So of course it's the most powerful thing. And I agree with Jill, the ultimate healing tool for any one person is their voice. The harmonics and overtones that make your voice sound like you is the uniqueness of the physical structure of your vocal cords that gives your voice its timbre, why you sound like you. Harmonic overtone pattern, like it's a fingerprint in your voice. It's like how the government can tell who's on a cell phone from a satellite. Voice print analysis, fingerprint in your timbre, in your voice. And it doesn't stop just at your voice. I mean, the harmonics and overtones in the tissues of your vocal cords are every place in your whole body. It's not just your voice. It didn't have some door that makes it stop there. So if I do an Om chant or I do some kind of a chanting exercise, I'm resonating my own body with my own timbre of harmonic overtone patterns that match. And if I can find a fundamental tone to sing that really aligns, now we're getting somewhere. I think that's what original mantra was all about. Finding what tone to sing to align it all.
Yeah, I mean, if I can speak, this is really what my life's work has been about. Well, first of all, I should say my mother was a concert pianist, so I was brought up in a house with 3 concert grand pianos, and so I think my womb was my presence in the womb was heavily bombarded. And as a child, my godfather had a piano factory, and so when I was a tiny child, I was taken to wander about the innards of, the actions of disembodied pianos, and well, my mother holed up with my godfather, and and in relation to science, it's interesting because I spent several years working with Stockhausen, who of course invented electronic music, and so I spent time in the electronic music studio at the Cologne Radio, which was in the early days of electronic music. He created music out of sine waves, so that was bread on the bone as well, in a way. But I spent many years before that studying with Tibetan lamas, and my son is now an electronic musician, and so. But I firmly stuck to the voice, and I think that's related probably because I spent so long practicing in Tibetan Buddhism, and felt the power of the voice but actually, when I started, when I started because I realized that we'd gone silent, and so I was looking for a very the ur sound, the original, something completely fundamental, and one of the things that Karl-Heinz wrote was a piece called Stimmung in '68, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is a piece for six singers singing harmonic vocal, a very simple form of vocal harmonics. But by that time, I'd already studied with Tibetans, and so I I realized that perhaps if we're going to sing again, if we're going to rediscover the sonorous world, which in a sense we had given up to the professionals through musical literacy and so forth, I felt that it had to be something very profound because, we tuned our music out of tune in the 17th century and very subtly so. And so I wanted the sounds that we made to be in tune with our own geometry so that we could actually hear our sonorous geometry. And so and so the form of chanting that I started teaching were vocal harmonics, where you chant on a single note, and which note, of course, is the big question, as you mentioned. But then by changing the shape of the resonant cavity, you amplify the harmonics so they're louder than the fundamental. And in this way, you can be in tune, as you cannot be with Western music, which is inevitably, either the intervals are stretched or squashed, but with harmonics, with resonance, you can only be in tune, and in tune with your own body, and so this was the approach that I've taken over the last, dare I say, 40 years, in getting people to reclaim their voices, so that it's not just a passive listening, but it's actually a participation in the sound making itself, so that we as tubes with holes in us become the instrument and not only resonate our own body, but also use sound as the instrument of presence. And this is, for me, the key. If you make sound which is not too disturbing, not too melodic, not too, like a drone with the harmonics, but you embed your listening into the sound itself, so you're creating a circuit of attention, then that's the best way of being present, and then everything else can unfold from there.
That's cool.
If I
Well,
may, sorry, if I may share at this point, the wisdom that both of you are bringing to the space here is so enlightening for someone like me, who's been a young artist, born in India, traveled the world to move through so many different genres of music, from films to electronic music to eventually discovering frequencies, brainwaves, the harmonic series, and understanding that we've been listening out of tune. And also understanding that sound travels through three different mediums, like Dr. Jeff mentioned, through liquid and through air, but we also experience it through bone conduction, which I believe is the fastest way that sound travels through our being. And when I discovered this aspect with Dr. Jeff and with Subpack, this product that makes you feel vibration, low frequency vibration in the body, I started to question, why is it that firstly we're listening out of tune? And why is it that we're listening only through the medium of air? We have all of these tools today that we can actually embody ourselves through understanding the power of the voice, through understanding that we've gone silent. And also, I truly believe that the reason we've gone silent is because people are scared of music. Most times when you ask people, are you playing music? Are you singing something? No, I can't sing. I can make music. There's a disconnect. And I find that that's the part where, that disconnect is also allowing us in some way to be disconnected to ourselves. And so it's just this wisdom of having both of your presence in this space and sharing this information for younger audiences. It's so important because we really need to know that there's so much electronic music out in the world. There's so much music out in the world. And musicians have the power to create, but why are we not creating? in resonance with nature, with ourselves, and the larger ecosystem. So I just wanted to share that in between both of your.
Can I just quickly say, I mean, I think one of the reasons we have gone silent is and are scared of music is because it's been hijacked by the professionals through musical literacy. So it's assumed that to be a musician you need to read music, um, and therefore, interestingly, the word is execute other people's music. I always find that a very interesting use of language, and so I think that's one of the big reasons, because it's a closed shop for many people, and so the temptation has always been to objectify professionals and try and cram it back inside the body with earphones through some device, because because we feel unqualified, and that music is. I mean, it's interesting. An amateur, the word amateur means to love something, and having spent time with, when Stockhausen was conducting orchestras, and sometimes they were, except with the exception of the Berlin Philharmonic, which was terrifyingly amazing, and they loved each other instantly. But I remember the Fenici in Venice. I remember they were sort of throwing ink pellets at each other. It was, it was infantilized, because somehow professionals sometimes don't always love what they do.
As soon as you take music, which is a thing of the heart, and you make it a profession, now you're going to work. I've always had a thing about the difference between reading music and playing usually a dead person's music from a few hundred years ago. You're playing their music by reading it off a page, and then you're interpreting that music, maybe putting your own little spin on it. But most of the really high-level professional musicians who can do that don't make their own music. There's no music coming out of them. They're playing other people's music, but they're not playing their own music. And so from what separates sort of the men from the boys in that world is who can allow the emotion that's coming from that music to color it themselves, as opposed to a technician who's reading something off a page and mechanically reproducing it with their fingers. When I was 6, I took my first piano lessons. I've been musical since the beginning. I'd sort of make music on anything I could find, but I studied like a fiend, absolutely like a fiend, when I was 6, because I was in love with my piano teacher. And I wanted to impress her, 6 years old, give me a break. But then finally she moved away, and she was replaced by some old lady who didn't have the same pizzazz. And that was the end of my piano lessons. And from one standpoint, thank God, because now I have 90 albums and I don't read music. And when I have discussions with professional musicians who know all the deeps and depths of music theory and notes on a page and how to play those, I realize that the music that comes from me, when I allow it to come through and I step out of my own way and the best stuff comes through, it obeys all the rules and regulations of music theory, but yet I'm not professionally schooled that way. Why? Because real music comes before the professional. The real laws of music come naturally out of the universe, and then people take note of that and invent musical systems and notes on a page to describe what nature produces automatically. Real musicians, it comes naturally, it just comes out. The subtle shades of chord arrangements and relationships of frequencies and all the rest. And then when we talk about this concept of entrainment, where you can use science to build pulses in the music to entrain your brainwaves. If the pulses are brainwave speed, I think that there's a higher level of that. For instance, someone like the Mozarts of the world, who sort of create a symphony, their first symphony when they're 4. Well, the fact that they can write the music is incidental. The music is coming out of them, and then they're writing it down. That's a different thing. And it seemed to be a unique pattern there. If I can go into a space of consciousness in myself that is an emotional space, the music that I pull from that space entrains anyone who hears that music to the same space. It communicates directly to the emotions. That's what I call higher order entrainment. If I can be in that emotion and pull music from that space, when you listen to it, it puts you there too. That's aside from something like that's more scientific with binaural beats, where I can create sounds that are pulsing at a brainwave speed that entrain your brainwaves to a certain state. I can change your state of consciousness with sound scientifically that way. But the deeper I get into that with EEG machines and fancy schmancy equipment and all that kind of stuff, I see that the damn Tibetans did it 3,000 years ago with Tibetan bowls. So when you rub one of those Tibetan bowls, it's a beautiful sound, but inside that sound, there's a pulse. And the pulse is a brainwave speed. So it's a brainwave entrainment device using binaural beats in a single sound source. I sort of call it a monophonic binaural beat. They even knew that. So sort of puts me in my place, keeps me humble.
Yes, it's I mean, it's interesting. My mother, who was a concert pianist, as I mentioned, she couldn't improvise. And my husband, Rupert, he again he can play anything, but he can't improvise. And whereas I brought up both my sons, Cosmo, who's a musician, and Merlin, who are both, well, they're both musicians. Cosmo is professional, but Suzuki, so that they didn't learn to read music. And in fact, Cosmo, who's an astonishing musician, still doesn't really, and his most amazing music is improvised. So there seems to be a you know one they're different languages. It's very I think it's quite often people who execute, to use that word again, music. Find it very difficult if they're literate, musically literate. They rely on what they see, the notes, rather than allowing it to come through. So I think these two things can be inimical, really. Not always. I did have one student who could do both, but it's quite unusual, I think. But
I think so.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just was same thing with my son. His mom was went to Interlochen College, so she could sight read. His grandmother on her side was a professional cellist and worked with 3 symphonies, symphony orchestras. And me, I'm a musician, but I can't read music. So I knew he had the gene, and I could see it in him. And people were knocking on my head saying, get him into piano lessons, get him into piano lessons. And I refused. I wanted him to discover music first as a joy, as a pursuit in its own right. I wanted him to start banging away on things and forcing it to come out into something nice sounding, and experience the joy of that first.
And
he did. And then to realize that there was a science behind that you could learn what that all means, so that he could discover it from the joy of music first. And I think maybe the professional musicians who began that way are the ones who had the ability to make their own music, as well as read other people's music. Depends on whether they're a professional or not.
Yeah, I think it's quite tricky, because I think sometimes when people don't spend time, I mean, one of the things about Suzuki is, of course, that the parent spends a lot of time with the child. but I mean, I know a lot of potentially very musical children who've never had that kind of encouragement to learn an instrument, and so their musicality never really developed in any kind of way that they could manifest. But so it's a very tricky balance that. But one of the things that I find is, teaching people the harmonic chant, where you amplify the harmonics so they're louder. Very often I find I have professional musicians who are instrumentalists, and sometimes an instrumentalist can't sing at all, and which is the singing, of course, is the most fundamental, and it's almost as if playing an instrument is a displacement activity. It's almost as if it's something that people do if they can't sing. I mean, sometimes, I'm not saying. I mean, most musicians, of course, can also sing, but I mean, there are some who can't, and of course, that's a very invidious position to be in. And so I've found that the teaching of the harmonics for such people is a wonderful way for them to rediscover and reclaim their voice. And it is with everybody, actually, because there's no, you don't have to have an audition or sing in tune or which is quite scary for a lot of people. I mean, when I was a child, if you wanted to join a choir, you had to sing in tune, have an audition, read music, and now I think there are something like 200,000 people in the UK, I read the other day, who are part of choirs, and you don't, there are all these wonderful community choirs where you don't have to do any of those things. And that's, and there's a man in England called Gareth Malone who started taking music to, people on ships and in factories and training all these people to sing in ways that perhaps I wouldn't train people to sing, but nevertheless it was completely glorious and a real awakening for people, the joy, because you can't feel depressed when you're singing. It's very, very difficult. And so I think anybody who has any kind of mental instability or depression should be able to have an opportunity to sing together with other people, because it's such a joyful activity.
I agree. There is an interesting phenomenon about singing. I mean, there's an element of stage fright. And when they do surveys that the top 10 list of fears, the greatest fears, number one is not death. It's public speaking. Death is number two. and then it even puts singing in public. I mean, that's even worse. It's like the ultimate stage fright or something. But it's a complex mix of something you said before, which is once the professionals took over music, then regular people singing or making music felt they didn't have permission to do that anymore, unless you could do it perfectly. You can't sing unless you can sing every note perfectly and you sound professional. If you can't do that, then you're not allowed to sing, except in the shower, maybe. But there's a certain portion of my sound work where I'm using sort of medical monitors to look at your nervous system and look at your brain and do some testing to find out what frequencies are the best ones for you to balance things out. And then I will record you singing that note, and I'll use your voice as the healing tool. And at the point when I put these 3D microphones on you and play the reference tone that you're supposed to sing, just about every single person that I've ever done with this freaks out. They go, oh no, I have to sing, oh no. And I'm going, whoa, a whole society of people that don't sing. No wonder we're so screwed up. I mean, this fear of singing. So I have to do it first. I have to sing that note first to give them permission to look like an idiot or something like that, So that's a profound thing about the professionals took the music away from the people.
And I think
I totally agree with that.
But also there's an invidious comparison. I remember once in one of my workshops, I had a very, very famous bass baritone singer. I mean, a big diva, Willard White, very famous man. And at the same time, I had a woman who'd been in opera, a professional woman in opera, who ended up teaching, and she wouldn't dare sing in front of him, you know. So there's no level at which there isn't this invidious comparison and shame, you know, if you're not as good as another person. And I think it's being judged. I think your voice is like your soul, and I think people feel their soul is being judged. And there's no level at which this doesn't exist, I find.
And I just want to share at this point this silence to sound, that space between silence and sound, right? There's the wisdom of silence where we've reached the point of meditative silence. But then there's the silence that Jill, you're talking about, where, and Dr. Jeff, you're talking about, that leads to fear and not being able to sing. So it's in that space between the silence and sound that we can actually instigate the possibility of freedom. Because again, just to remind, this topic is about sound as freedom, sound and music as freedom, and inviting people into that space. So how do both of you invite, from your own perspectives, this level of freedom that people can actually not feel so scared to enter the space of singing, and not feel judged, and not feel, you know, overwhelmed even? Because I know that singing connects you to your soul, connects you to emotions, and emotions are so bad in the world we live in today. If you're emotional and you're sharing your emotions, then you're not strong enough, or you're weak, and so you must not share that. So how would both of you give some light into inviting people into that space of not being able to sing, but transmuting that space?
Interesting you talk about the between silence and sound, because technically that you might call that the attack, you know, and the attack is that aspect of sound which has the most information, and whenever you're starting a note in any instrument, not even necessarily the voice, it's the trickiest one to begin because there's so much information in it, and that's why sometimes it's easier to start very quietly and get louder. But I mean, I just say, you know, quickly that I mean, my approach has always been, you know, getting people of very mixed backgrounds. Some people who, you know, in the groups that I have, there are always people, singers and non-singers, and everything in between. And what I'm teaching is usually, because the vocal harmonics are usually strange to most people. I mean, less so now than when I started. I mean, when I started, people had never heard of harmonics practically, or overtones, and so I started doing something which was strange to both of them, and and most people, you know, even if you can't sing in tune, you know, most people can sing on one note, so that overcomes one aspect, you know, which is, you know, I can't keep a note, or I can't match a note, or match a pitch, or sing in tune, or whatever. So if you're singing on one note, because being in tune is relative, it's to do with two notes, and so being on one note makes it a lot easier. And if you have a group doing that together, then you can weave in and out, you know, because you don't have to be audible. You can stop and breathe, and somebody's breathing for you. You don't even need to breathe all the time, and so it's very unfrightening, because you're never exposed. You're never having to do it on your own. You're part of the group, which you can be as much part of or not, and listen to it even more if you prefer. So that the listening is the key as well. So that's how I have always found it a very unintimidating way of doing it. And of course, the gift of sound is silence. You can only find silence through sound.
I sort of agree that the fear of singing in any kind of way is a construction by society. We've been taught that. We've been taught to be afraid. So when I'm playing this reference tone and I'm telling a person I want to record their voice singing that note, and everybody freaks out and says, "Oh no, I can't sing," and I'm kind of going, well, that's not exactly singing. Singing is being able to hit a whole bunch of different notes and hit them all exactly. That's singing. But this is more like toning. You're going to only sing one note. So to get people loosened up, I'll sing it, and then I'll tell them, sing a note, any note, doesn't matter what it is, just anything. Just take a big breath and blow it across your vocal cords and make some sound come out. And then I'll play the reference tone and say, now I want you to match your voice to that tone. And most people don't think they can do it, but 95% of the people can immediately, instantaneously. They'll hit maybe a slightly different note and retune it in the first second. But once they've done it, I go, hey, you just did that. And people are surprised. And then it's kind of reminding of, think of all the different mechanisms that had to happen inside your brain for you to do that. You had to hear the tone, your brain had to match that tone, it had to send signals down a cranial nerve into your voice box and tighten everything up in just exactly the right way to make it vibrate and matching with that tone. All of the different things that had to happen there to make that happen is profound and amazing. And then you realize that this set of harmonics and overtones that your voice is producing is unique to you, like a fingerprint. When you're in a group and you do a group chant, say for instance an Om chant, everybody's going to start chanting. There's this period of time when it's sort of cacophonic. There's nobody's singing exactly in tune with each other. It's sort of this period where the group finds its voice, and then everybody centers in on some kind of single note. That's a phenomenon called coupled oscillators, where you're forming a coupled oscillator network, where things in the universe want to dance together in order to save energy. Everything wants to synchronize up in order to save energy. So that's a good example of that. You get a group of people who start to try to sing an Om chant, and you'll hear it collect and collect and collect and center itself on a certain note. That's a coupled oscillator network in action. But there's something there, because the frequency that the group ends up with, unless there's somebody who leads that and says, sing this note. If you let the group find the note, then there's something significant about that. And then respiration is intimately involved with this, because, really, me as a musician, my whole musical repertoire is stringed instruments. I was never very good at wind instruments. Other people are the other way. Some people are ambidextrous. But I realized that, there's this principle that I think I've stumbled on. I call it the principle of Gadifadib. God did it first and did it better. Principle of Gadifadib. And it means that if God was a musician, then it would be what we've got. We've got a stringed instrument here that's played by wind. It's both instruments in one. It's a tube with strings.
Well, the strings aren't quite strings; they are attached.
They're attached. Well, strings are attached.
The chords are kind of part of the muscle. They're not actual strings.
Well, it would be sort of like strings with muscles in a way, but yeah, it's this thing that can come in and out together.
Yeah.
But they're vibrating.
Yeah.
Wind is making something vibrate, which is sort of like a string.
And on that note of if God was a musician, this is a very interesting point to riff off on. In my journey, I asked many times, where does sound come from? And everybody that I met started saying it's an oscillator, it's a synthesizer, yada, yada. And then it came to a simple, it's an action and a reaction. And I was like, wait, where is the action coming from? And I was told very clearly, you're asking me who's God. And so at that point in time, at that point of intersection, there was this huge awakening and realization that in the Hindu scriptures and in many cultures in the world that we live in, first came the word, and the word was God, and then came light. Nada Brahma, sound is creation. And so if there is that awareness of a primal awareness that sound is what creates matter, it's what creates energy that's in motion, that creates emotion, then why have we lost the value of this power and, sent it out to entertainment or sent it out to control and power and not allowing people to sing? How do we bring that value back? That sound is actually freedom. It is actually what creates life, what creates matter, and it's what we can do to heal ourselves.
Yes, I'd like to just come in on that. One of the things that happens when people chant together is there's a moment when the inner question that sometimes people ask is, who is chanting me? So it's like that we are a kind of vessel of some higher power. It definitely feels like that, and my raison d'être for working in groups, having people come together in groups, is to connect with the divine, or the one, whatever name you might want to give that, to overcome separation. Because if you're making, you can only make sound in the present. It's not possible to make it yesterday or tomorrow. But if you are listening to that sound as you're making it, then the circuit of attention means you can only be present. And being present isn't easy. All the sort of meditative techniques of all the different traditions have invented methods for being present. There are hundreds of different ones. But of all the ones, and I've tried quite a lot of them, and of all the ones that I've come across, making sound and listening to it, or just one sound, as you were saying, Jeffrey, nothing complicated, nothing which is challenging or rhythmic or melodic, but just one sound, but allowing the harmonics to emerge and become audible. This and listening to it makes it possible to be present. One of the things about Western music is, it's like language. It's in time. It takes you from here to there. It has a time signature. It's based on dance, so it allows you to be time, in time. Whereas the whole point about mantric chanting or harmonic chanting is that mantra is very interesting, because usually there are various words. They have translations, and they're usually some aspect of of consciousness. But there's no discursive sentence usually, and anybody who translates a mantra as a sentence doesn't really understand what it's about. Each word is an induction of some state of consciousness, and they're kind of strung together. But they're repeated, and so because they're repeated, they corral the mind, and they stop the mind wandering off in a direction from here to there, and contain it. So it's like a spiral, it contains you in the present. It doesn't allow you to disappear off somewhere. Firstly, because it's not in any kind of translatable language. It's also in an archaic language, but there's no sentence with a beginning, middle, and an end. And also because it repeats. And so this way, it keeps the mind in the present, whereas Western music takes it on a journey.
You're talking about the really the beauty of Indian music, where there's this drone instrument that's these 4 strings on the tambura. So it's bom, 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 bom. So it's the tonic note, 2 strings to the same tonic note. The 3rd string is an octave below that tonic note, and the 4th string is a harmonic 5th. And the harmonic 5th is close to the golden section ratio, which is this divine proportion thing. Yeah. So it's reiterating some cosmic thing going on, that then the sitar is going to be creating a melody line that's sort of like jazz. It's in the moment. It's being created out of the moment. It's not a piece of music that you've memorized that you're going to play. It's coming from the soul, and it's weaving around this central point, very similar to the way life is. And then underneath those 7 strings on the sitar are these 13 strings that are all tuned in harmonic ratios to the 7 strings above. So you'll pull some string and it'll sing out these 13, some of the certain 13 strings underneath, all of it is the science of sound, and all of its elements beautiful.
And all with some unbelievably complicated rhythm played on the tabla.
Oh, the drums! I mean, Ali, the most famous drummer can keep 120 beats at the same time, and then when those beats all, like one of those beats is one every 3 minutes, bang, and then the other ones are like all in layers, and then at the end of the piece, they all come together at the same moment and end at the same moment. Everybody jumps up and starts clapping, and the Westerners don't have a clue what just happened. Have no educated ear to understand what just took place.
Absolutely.
It's profound. There's another thing that I've done with voice as part of what my practice is. I'm going to record your voice singing this tone that I've come up with that's going to balance your nervous system on a computer screen. And then I'm going to take that recording and put it into my electronic equipment and slow it down by precise octaves. Now, every octave will make the wine glass vibrate. There's this mathematical relationship. So if I slow your voice down by various octaves, at a certain point, you can't recognize this as your voice anymore. It's sort of the cosmic Om sound.
You take the speaking tone as the basis.
I'll find a frequency that balances your nervous system and have you sing it, and I'll record your voice singing it with 3D microphone.
How do you find that pitch?
I use a sophisticated heart rate variability device. So I'll hook you up to this HRV device, and it shows me the sympathetic, parasympathetic live on my computer screen. And when you lay down on your back, in this case, you're laying on a sound table. You lay on your back, and when you lay on your back, the sympathetic, parasympathetic should reach a 0 stress point, homeostasis. That's because when I'm upright, like I am now, gravity is pulling the blood out of my head. And barometric receptors in my carotid arteries signal that pressure drop and kick my sympathetic up and kick my adrenals and raise my blood pressure to equalize that. So all of us who are upright have a little bit of higher blood pressure and a little bit of sympathetic tone. When you lay down on your back, flat, it's easiest to pump the blood on a horizontal plane, so there's no more gravity stress. And the sympathetic, when you first lay down, I should see sympathetic tone on from gravity stress. And I should see it relax down to 0, and it should do that in 3 minutes. That's the medical standard. Mm-hmm. We're looking for that. It's a clinical evaluation of your stress handling system. And if it doesn't do that, if after 5 minutes or 10 minutes the sympathetic is still on, this is a positive clinical finding of a runaway fight or flight response, burning up all your resources. I believe that's the ultimate cause of disease. The system can't right itself, can't work on its systems, it can't balance things, it can't rebuild systems because it's distracted and all of its energy is removed to run this fight or flight response because I think I'm threatened. So my innovation is there's a sound frequency that's very precise to a couple of decimal points that will push the reset button and make it collapse to 0. I don't know what frequency that is, so I've created a sound sweep of all frequencies from 50 hertz to 200 hertz that goes through your body through the sound table. And as it's slowly changing its tuning and reaching the good spot for you, I can see your sympathetic responding to it and collapsing down. So
and I wondered how does that respond to the vocal tone of somebody's speaking voice, for example?
Well, so
is it in a totally different range, or because I haven't been on your table, so I don't know.
Well, once I find a frequency that does that job, every octave of that frequency works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it could be anywhere. Yeah.
Create that balance. So any octave will work. The octaves, the low octaves work through different doorways. Like some of those octaves, the vibration frequency network is 0.3 hertz to 500 hertz skin sensors, posterior spinal cord. And so each one of those octaves causes this balance, but at the high end towards 500 hertz, you'll feel it through your skin. If I drop in an octave, you feel it through your muscles. If I drop in an octave, you feel it through your joints and discs. Another octave is a bone conduction octave, a fluid conduction octave, and octaves below that are not sound anymore, below 20 hertz. It's brainwave frequencies, beta, alpha, theta, delta. So now if I use entrainment to entrain your brainwaves to any of those octaves, we also cause the balance in the nervous system. So we can start to use those things together. But what I'm using to create that effect as a sound is an artificial sound I created by combining the harmonics of cello and flute and some nice instruments. But the ultimate is to have you sing that note, play that note that we found, and have you sing it.
Yeah.
And then use your voice through the sound table. And when we slowed the voice down to a point where you can't recognize this as your voice anymore, we're activating subconscious recognition at a deep unconscious level. Unconscious can certainly recognize that. And who's recognizing it is the part of me that grew my body out of 2 cells and differentiated the tissues and make it all run on automatic. And my identity, my biological organic intelligence is who's recognizing that. And that's where the healing is. That's where the door opens to higher states of consciousness. Is who I'm trying to get to when I'm doing a mantra. So ultimately what we're using is science to discover what is the mantra tone for you, because this homeostasis point is not just relaxation. This is zero stress in the system. Zero stress in the system is a very special state. It's where I feel safe.
I also try and get people to find their own sound too, and because it's interesting. I mean, you're very much coming from the electronic point of view, and I'm very much coming from the vocal point of view. But having people try to find their own sound. I mean, this comes in Indian music, and not in the Western music where people just try and stretch their, get as high as they can or as low as they can or whatever.
Exactly.
But what I found is that the only way really to do that is you have to use your voice a lot, because it doesn't work otherwise. So I have people record their voice in an environment where there are no radiators making noises or passing cars, so nothing that you can entrain with. So, but you have to do that so much. And you also have to be using your voice a lot at the same time, for it to kind of come into its own place. But I think that's very important. But also when chanting, I mean, in terms of your octave, it would need to be in a place, especially if you want to do the harmonics, you need a certain tension in the voice. So if you're too low, more of you is vibrating, but there's no tension. If you're too high, there's too much tension, and you can't hear the harmonics because they go out of range. So it's a real balance between being as low as you can while having enough tension to at the same time be able to hear and produce also the harmonics, because you need tension to produce them. So,
there's a perfect octave for each person. So there's a perfect place for your voice where it's right in that spot where it's got the tension, but it's not too low, it's not too high. So setting the reference tone properly for a man versus a woman in general is important. But the other interesting thing scientifically, once I've got your voice captured in my system, and I start slowing your voice down so it becomes unrecognizable, the high harmonics that you normally can't hear are being cut in half in speed over and over again. So the really high harmonics you normally can't hear are now what makes the sound you're hearing. They're now in the mid-range. So you can hear aspects of your voice you've never heard before. It's a very interesting experience to scientifically sort of pick apart the vocal harmonic patterns that you see on a spectrograph, where you can see all the harmonics and overtones, and you can click your mouse on each one and find exactly what frequency it is, and you can see that all those harmonic spikes are either exact octaves or harmonic thirds or fifths or sevenths or ninths. You can pick it apart. You can see that that's how the body tunes itself is
Yeah.
exact harmonic ratios.
So everybody has their own. It's a bit like, cooking. You have a certain amount of each herb, and everybody has their
Yeah,
own
yeah,
constituent
I like that.
harmonic.
You're
And
you're
so,
you're your own stew, right? Your unique stew.
I had somebody once in one of my workshops who captured the harmonic sound of the whole group, and underneath was this continuous tone, and I had to tell him that this was a device for frightening away the mice. And my and my son my, my son Cosmo can't compose in our house anymore because we have
You
these
got the little thing going, right?
the milestone. But I think my mice have become deaf now. I think we've only got deaf mice in the house because they don't
Well,
seem to.
they're deaf to that specific frequency. That's
so
too
at
funny.
this, so at this point, just keeping time in check because we've getting closer to the end of this dialogue. It's been so interesting to hear both of your perspectives really tuning the voice. The voice is actually one of the most important tools that we have as a human being that we should use. So that's something that we can take for all the people listening. And Dr. Jeff, the way you use the voice and use science and use electronic music per se to go beyond just music to vibrations to brainwaves to finding different tones for biotuning, let's say, it automatically shows you and shows us the transformative power of sound and the use of it. Because, there's a dime a dozen things going on in the space of entertainment. And it's great and it should continue. But I feel like this conversation has really revealed the power that we need to spend more time researching and diving deeper into these spaces of potential that are here always, but need more attention. So thank you both for your wisdom, your love, your energy, and continuing this work that you're sharing out in the world. We hope that we, as young people, can take this on and really continue this process to bring a deeper level of understanding of sound, consciousness, brain health, and mind-body connection in a way that connects us to ourselves and to the all-encompassing force that's brought us here in the first place. So thank you all for this. And if you have any last thoughts before we close up this dialogue, it would be wonderful for those that are watching.
I just kind of think that, a whole society of people that don't sing or are afraid to sing, that's devastating to a society. And especially since every single person in sort of the civilized world has a personal acoustic sanctuary where they could sing, the shower. Everybody's got one. So we should all use it. I mean,
Yes, I mean,
that's
I think it's a symptom of the state of the world that we don't sing, but it is changing. I mean, all these community choirs, it really is changing now.
I think everything is changing. So that's a good sign of change, is that if people are starting to wake up to the power of sound and music, and they have their own instrument, they don't have to go buy something. It's supplied by nature. It's here. And the professionals who have sort of stolen the show and say, well, if you can't do it this way, then you don't have permission to, is devastating. And now it's even worse because ordinary musicians can't even make a living anymore. It's all corporate music now. It's sort of back to the roots of just being able to make your own music, tune or out of tune, who cares? And, if you're so out of tune that you can't tell that you're out of tune or not, then you certainly sound in tune to yourself, and that's all this important, right?
I mean, you have to show off first of all. I mean, the one thing you don't, when if somebody tells you can't sing in tune, the things that you need to do, which is show off, and make a loud noise are the very things that you don't want to do. So, um,
Yeah, yeah.
So should we end on a note of singing together? Maybe that would be a great way, inviting all people to start using their showers to sing. And if we could come together to close this space of sound.
That's a cool
yeah,
thing.
unfortunately, with Zoom, you can't sing together. That's the one thing. Since COVID, I've been doing my workshops online, so I had to record all my group chants because Zoom hasn't yet managed to synchronize people's upload and download times. So,
Jill, if you don't mind sharing an overtone chant, just you, and then we could listen to close.
okay. I can't hear you. Everybody's gone quiet.